You know, when I grew up, everybody was excited for video game sequels. Not just because games were better back then, but more significantly, game sequels were better. Much better. Before massive $50 million AAA budgets and 1,000-man development teams, games were made in a year or two tops, and their sequels just as fast. And in spite of this lightning-fast turnaround, developers somehow managed to both correct the mistakes of the previous game and expand on the core mechanics significantly. Here's just a short list of legendary game sequels: Super Mario Bros. 3, Majora's Mask, Crash Bandicoot 2, Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, Halo 2, Half-Life 2, Mass Effect 2, and the list goes on and on. Only in the past 7 years have game sequels finally reached Hollywood territory, where each iteration is an even more lifeless husk than the last. So today, let's talk about a great sequel that almost reaches the level of a masterpiece, held back by obnoxious scripted sequences and the high standards set by its predecessor. Dead Space 2 easily could have joined that list of legendary sequels, but you can feel the intrusive claws of EA start to dig into the core game design and hold it back from the 10 out of 10 it deserves. First, let's talk about the improvements. Dead Space 1 is still a fantastic game. If you've seen my Versus video comparing it in Doom 3, you know that I love it, and think it's one of the greatest horror games of all time. There were only a few elements holding it back: terrible weapon balance, slight lack of enemy variety, and revisiting old levels. Dead Space 2 has fixed all three of these issues. First off, the weapons. I'll try not to waste too much time on this segment, because I know I love to drone on and on about weapon rolls and stats and shit, and you guys probably just want to know the important parts. So I'll briefly talk about the changes to old weapons and mostly cover the new ones. First off, the plasma cutter has been slightly nerfed. Emphasis on slightly, because you can pretty much do exactly what you did in the first game. Spend all of your power cores to max it out early game, and shred every enemy in 2 to 3 shots for the next 5 hours. The nerf only becomes noticeable once the enhanced necromorphs show up, and it takes at least 5 shots to take them down. On higher difficulties, which you should be playing on, trust me, this can be a death sentence. Other necromorphs will swarm you and tear you to pieces as you try to focus one enemy at a time. Visceral added a special upgrade that adds a burning status effect on shots, but it's basically just a small damage upgrade. Still tied for best gun in the game though. Next is the Force Gun, the shotgun of Dead Space. Despite being the second best gun of the first game, it's been buffed. Hard to say if it's an actual buff or if the addition of the pack and crawlers, the children and infant necromorphs, just further increased its utility. One-shotting groups of weak enemies and two-shotting stronger ones with the alt fire makes it now tied for best gun with the plasma cutter. The contact beam has also been upgraded. Primary fire is still a one-hit kill on any basic necromorph, but its real buff is in the alt fire. The final upgrade applies a max upgraded status effect to enemies surrounding you. This is very situationally broken, as you can see in this late game elevator section. The contact beam also destroys the final boss in 4 shots. It's absolutely ridiculous. The last buffed weapon is surprisingly the pulse rifle. What was basically a joke weapon from the first game, requiring a full magazine to take down one necromorph, is now surprisingly powerful. The alt fire is now a grenade launcher, great for crowds, obviously, but costs a lot of ammo per shot. After upgrading damage a few times, it only takes 3 to 6 shots to chop off a limb, which is surprisingly ammo efficient. It's probably still a bit worse overall than the plasma cutter, but it can be a viable alternative, which, honestly, I might be getting a bit nitpicky here, but does that bother anybody else? In universe, pulse rifles are supposed to be against necromorphs, so now that they're pretty good, the only logical explanation for the security forces being wiped out so easily is that they don't know that you're supposed to shoot the limbs, which makes sense in the first game, but wouldn't every officer working in the government sector on the Sprawl be briefed on containment procedure? Not even necessarily briefing them on necromorphs, but having some kind of emergency protocol activated on a containment breach that would tell officers how to kill necromorphs. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Anyway, the rest of the old guns are more or less the same. Line gun got a slight buff to its alt fire, but I'd say it's not worth the power core investment. Ripper is still just okay, very situational. And the flamethrower is still a giant piece of don't use it. Just don't. Now for the new guns. The javelin gun was a bit of a disappointment. It has crazy high damage per shot, but the alt fire is borderline useless and it has terrible ammo efficiency. On higher difficulties, you only get 1 shot per ammo drop, and unless you've maxed out damage on the primary fire, it can't even kill a bog standard slasher with that 1 javelin. Not to mention, its alt fire, an electric discharge from the last javelin fired, costs ammo. The AoE effect on it is negligible, which is why it's useless. So while it's a cool concept, it's just not practical. The Seeker rifle, on the other hand, takes the high damage per shot concept and cranks it to the max. Who would have guessed that a marksman rifle would be one of the best guns in a CQC action horror game? It's insanely good. It takes out necromorphs in 2 shots, gets 2 to 3 ammo per drop, and has a zoom function that adds even more damage. If you're a bad shot, just use stasis to slow the necromorphs down and you'll do just fine. Tied with the contact beam overall for the second best gun. Next is the detonator. It places mines. That's about it. It's a fun gun on repeat playthroughs if you know the enemy spawns, but otherwise wouldn't really recommend it. Finally, the Rivet Gun. It's most of you probably don't remember this gun because you can only get it if you pre-ordered the game from GameStop or bought the in-game Supernova pack, which is $5, by the way. Luckily, the Steam version came with all that crap. You're not missing anything. It's a much weaker plasma cutter with an alt fire that discharges the rivets, ricocheting them off of walls and hitting other enemies. It's useless. Though technically not a weapon, Kinesis has received a massive buff in this game as well. Using Kinesis on corpses auto-rips off any intact blades on slashers or stalkers, and the damage has been cranked as well. If you grab all 3 damage upgrades on your rig, you can take out a slasher in 1 hit with a blade. Heavy blunt weapons also knock over necromorphs, meaning you can essentially stun lock them to death without wasting ammo. A great change and adds another layer of skill to the combat. So, overall, the weapon balance allows for a much broader range of possibilities for your 4-slot arsenal, with nearly every gun in the game being viable to some degree. Combined with the signature dismemberment mechanic, combat is just as fun as the first game, with added replayability. So feel free to mix things up on your next playthrough. I could go into greater detail about the combat, but it's more or less the same as the first game, which is not a bad thing. The combat for the first game was fantastic, and it just needed a few tweaks, which the sequel fixed. So honestly, I wouldn't change anything about the shooting or kinesis or stasis. It's pretty much perfect. As for enemies, I think Visceral added just enough new enemy types to reduce that sense of repetition I felt near the end of the first game. All of the enemies from the first game are back, minus the Twitcher, the super fast military necromorphs. Alongside the classics, the most common new type is the Puker, which is pretty self-explanatory. It shoots spitballs to slow you down, then rushes you and vomits acid. I especially like the design of this one, with fused human legs on one side and a new leg made of fleshy muscle on the other. The rest of its body looks melted from the acid bile it produces. Definitely a cool addition. The pack are a bunch of children necromorphs that always attack in swarms and die in one hit. They're more of a distraction than a threat, honestly. One shot from the force gun and boom, problem solved. It's funny to watch their limbs fly through the air though. The crawler is a literal infant. Yes, an infant that explodes. Dead Space 1 was already pushing boundaries with the organ growth babies. Now we've got actual children, babies, and even newborn infant necromorphs of the residents of the sprawl. Brutal, man, just brutal. Crawlers also die in one hit like the pack, and if you hit them with the force gun or sever their head, you can pick them up and throw them like grenades. The Stalker is an interesting concept that ultimately was poorly executed. Their first appearance is pretty spooky, actually. You see them sneaking around the church, making weird screams, and just as you're about to enter the next room, something smashes the door from the other side. A lockdown initiates, and a bunch of these things enter the room, hiding behind corners and walls. The first time playing the game, these guys rushing you will freak you out and likely smash you to bits with their iron head. But once you calm down and realize the pattern, these guys are a joke. The problem is that they very obviously telegraph when they're going to charge you, and one leg shot with nearly every weapon in the game will dismember them. Even near the end of the game, you rarely have to face them mixed with other necromorph types, making them even easier to kill. This is one thing that was actually fixed in Dead Space 3's encounters, where stalkers are mixed with other enemy variants. The last new enemy is a mini-boss, the Tripod. A pretty cool enemy that makes for a good first boss. Unfortunately, every other encounter with it is a quick time event or scripted sequence, so its potential is a bit wasted. Which leads into the one problem with the enemy variety: lack of bosses. Dead Space 1's bosses were kind of shitty, but at least they tried. The sequel only has two true bosses, the first Tripod and the final boss. There's a really cool unique necromorph that shows up a third of the way through, but you kill it in a quick time event. What a waste. As we all know, in horror, the setting can be just as important as the story, characters, or in a video game's case, the mechanics. Dead Space 1 took place mostly on the USG Ishimura, a massive mining ship designed to lift chunks of a planet and harvest valuable resources. 80% of the game was spent traveling between areas of the ship and repairing various damaged components, often in zero gravity. This time around, Isaac Clarke's engineering expertise takes a backseat, and instead his damaged mind from the marker's influence is the focus. He starts in the psych ward on board the Sprawl, a moon-sized space station built to harvest resources from one of Saturn's moons, Titan. Over the course of the game, you'll explore a lot more urban environments, if tiny claustrophobic space apartments count as urban. This significantly changes the tone of the horror early on in the game, as Isaac is directly exposed to a necromorph outbreak as it is happening. So we get to see civilians savagely dismembered and losing their minds from the marker signal. Sadly, this only lasts for the first hour of the game. After that, everyone's dead, pretty much. It's a shame that we never get to see the full progression of an outbreak in these games. In Dead Space 3, we get to see a half-assed one with discount Resident Evil 4 enemies, but I want to experience a real one with more brutality. The space station setting allows for a completely different set of environments compared to the Ishimura, the most drastic change being the elementary school level. This level legitimately freaked me out when I first played the game. Just take a look at our intro to the crawler enemy. There's just something about schools in horror games that always works. Maybe because most of us hated school. But this overly streamlined yet familiar future school setting fits the entropy theme that Dead Space constantly pushes. It can be tiring even for a cynic like me, though, to constantly hear that humanity is doomed to die out from expending all resources in the galaxy, and necromorphs are just speeding up our inevitable end. Are we meant to believe that EarthGov and all of these future megacorporations are so stupid to not find a way to preserve entire planets worth of resources? Maybe find a way to force population control through forced sterilization, or accidental sterilization through food and water? I don't know, there's gotta be a better way, right? Anyway, the residential section eventually takes you to the Church of Unitology. Now, in the first game, we see these guys clearly have some screws loose, but some of that can be hand-waved away by marker influence. The basis in their religion of transcendence through reincarnation by the marker sounds fine, until everyone sees what that really means. Now, of course, every outbreak has been covered up by EarthGov at this point, but high-ranking Unitologists somehow know what the marker's true purpose is, and yet they still believe in convergence. This is basically a plot hole that is given a really shitty explanation in the third game. We'll get to that when I review Dead Space 3. But I just find it hard to believe that this religion has expanded to span every human colony, with billions of members, based on essentially suicide with extra steps. Being transformed into a disgusting zombie monster somehow evaded the public consciousness after this game, as we are told that Unitology has somehow overthrown the government by the time of Dead Space 3, yet we are told that multiple outbreaks have happened since Dead Space 2, and yet Unitology has this giant army of retards who are willing to be turned into disgusting mutated abominations on the off chance that they get to go to heaven. And remember, people, this is without the marker's influence. It's just not believable in any way. I've gone way off topic at this point, but the point of what I'm saying is that the psychological horror aspect has been cranked significantly, building off of the big reveal of the first game that Nicole was dead the whole time. Now Isaac constantly hallucinates Nicole, taunting him about her death. This ties into the larger plot where Isaac has to destroy the marker that his mind helped create. Basically, during his time in the psych ward, EarthGov was constantly drugging him while extracting blueprints for the marker from his brain. Now, with the help of fellow inmate Nolan Strauss and sole survivor of her mining squad, Ellie Langford, they have to find a way to escape the sprawl, which, of course, turns into Isaac choosing to be a big damn hero and destroy the giant marker instead. The greatest addition to this story being that Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist. Man, I hate silent protagonists. I have never felt more immersed by a character who doesn't talk. Usually the opposite. So Isaac now having a personality and being able to make his own decisions is definitely a good thing. The only downside is that he has a tendency to talk too much. In the later parts of the game, Isaac will talk to Ellie every 5 minutes, usually about some minor progress update or backstory. Compare this to being a mute errand boy, and playing Dead Space 2 after the first can be pretty jarring. This ties into a bigger problem overall with the game that we'll get to later. Eventually, Isaac's journey takes him once again to the USG Ishimura, which is still docked at the Sprawl for repairs and likely research purposes. This part of the game is pretty badass and reminds me of revisiting Shadow Moses in MGS4. Not quite as impactful, obviously, but it is impressive that Visceral redecorated large sections of the Ishimura with hazard tape, cloth, and construction equipment. The section with the UV light is pretty creepy, too. After reliving the nightmare, Isaac has to travel through the mines, which you, the player, realize is all that's left of Saturn's moon, driving home that entropy theme once again. After an intense drill riding sequence, Isaac and Ellie breach into the government sector, a pristine sci-fi R&D facility that contrasts well with the rusty grime of the previous section. There you confront Director Tideman, who honestly isn't a villain so much as the captain of a sinking ship. While he does try to kill you at various points during the game, it's more out of a justified fear that you're going to destroy the marker or spread the truth of EarthGov's experiments. So really he's just a government stooge, an obstacle more than a real challenge for the hero, which is exactly how it should be. The Necromorphs should be the main villains of these games, with Unitologists and EarthGov being useful tools to their greater purpose. I've talked about the story enough already, just in case any of you haven't played it yet, I won't spoil the rest. Just know that it's good, I promise you. But I did say that this game was a nearly perfect sequel, right? So let's get to the negatives. Well, I guess Resident Evil isn't the only franchise that struggled with this problem. I think every action horror franchise will face this issue at some point. And I get it, really. Naturally, with sequels, it only makes sense to try to expand on every aspect of the previous game. But with action horror, there's a very careful balance to maintain between fun combat and a legitimately terrifying atmosphere. This is where Dead Space 2 fares significantly worse than the first. The first few chapters of the game are great, but the fear factor starts going downhill with the subway sequence, where it turns out that the CEC installed Iron Man jet boosters into their suits. And it only gets worse from here. About halfway through the game, Isaac has to catch up to Ellie and Strauss, but they're on the other side of the station. So what does he do? He catapults himself with an ejector seat and straight up Supermans his way through giant flying debris, and somehow doesn't splatter into a thin paste when he lands on the other side of the station. While this is probably the most extreme, immersion-breaking sequence in the game, it's definitely not the only example. Clearly, Visceral had a higher budget for this game, but a lot of it feels wasted on weird, over-the-top shit. I suspect this is when EA started digging their grubby claws in development, because I can't see how anyone would think these segments would fit in a horror game. Some of them feel straight out of Uncharted, like the end of the subway sequence. Also, there are random utility vents that you have to crawl through, basically badly hidden loading screens. And these are just as stupid as the action bits. Where's the one place that Necromorphs use to travel through the ship? Exactly. And yet, you are never once attacked while climbing through one. You know what game handled this well? Alien Isolation. The zero-gravity segments have also been a bit oversimplified. You no longer solve puzzles while leapers and crawlers ambush you. Since you can fly now, leapers are no longer in these parts, replaced by these big tentacle globs that shoot homing shots at you. Puzzle rooms are devoid of enemies, and the other zero-G sections are huge ventilation shafts with hazards in them. While flying is cool, it's also surprisingly boring compared to jumping from wall to wall. The last problem, which I touched on earlier, is Isaac himself. While it's great that he's actually a character now, he just talks way too much. Not in a snarky Nathan Drake sort of way, he just communicates with the other characters too often. Which is probably realistic, but it even further removes horror from the story. Now, I'll admit that horror games with combat don't really scare me for the most part, but I can still appreciate all of the elements that exist to attempt to scare you. But Dead Space 2 has this identity crisis where it can't seem to decide if it wants to be more like the first game or Resident Evil 4. And while I love Resident Evil 4, Dead Space should balance action and horror, as that's what made it so acclaimed in the first place. Before I wrap this video up, I want to briefly mention Hardcore mode in the DLC. Hardcore mode is a unique difficulty setting that restricts you to 3 saves for the entire game, with no checkpoints in between. Enemy health and damage are set to the highest normal difficulty, Zealot. If that sounds excessively punishing and heartbreaking, that's because it is. It's really a test of memorization, knowledge of weapon balance, and the ability to keep calm under pressure more than it is about skill. I would highly recommend giving it a try if you can handle possibly losing hours of progress from dying. Your reward for beating it is the hand cannon, a foam finger that instantly kills any enemy. Sadly, the Steam version is bugged, so I don't have any nice 1080p footage, and I had to find this out the hard way, so I was really pissed. But I still had my old PS3 save file to show you that I've completed this nightmare twice. The DLC is okay. It's not on PC, funny enough, so I replayed it on PS3 after grabbing the hand cannon footage. Basically, it's just reused assets. You play as Gabe Weller, one of the 2 survivors of Dead Space Extraction, the on-rails shooter for the Wii, as he tries to find his wife and escape the sprawl. The campaign is barely over an hour, and is just the mines and hospital chapters played backward. It does bring back the Twitcher Necromorph, but ultimately I would say it's not worth your time or $5, especially since Gabe dies at the end, and the plot point about being immune to the marker signal never comes up again. So it's pointless.
The research in that marker is worth every life we just lost. I won't let you throw all this away.
So, at the end of the day, Dead Space 2 is an awesome game and a great sequel, but it could have been the greatest action horror game of all time, or at least in the top 5. Its top-notch combat, excellent environment design, and solid variety of enemies are dragged down by cheap spectacle. Personally, I think it still just barely edges out the first game in overall quality, but you can make a convincing argument for either one, really. I wish I could say the same for the third game. Don't worry, we'll get to it someday. But for now, if you haven't played Dead Space 2, well, you should play the first game first, but after you have, play the second. Trust me. If you have played it before, it's definitely one of those games worth replaying. After 9 years, you've probably forgotten most of it anyway. I still await the day that Dead Space 4 or a remake is announced, but as you already know, Visceral is long gone and EA doesn't give a shit about single-player games. So, moral of the story, EA. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Give the video a like, subscribe, helps with the algorithm, all that. This week, there's gonna be some experimental content coming out. A podcast, basically. Yeah, I know everyone and their grandmother has a podcast. This is more for fun, and I guess it keeps the channel slightly more active, which is supposed to help with the algorithm. Also, starting with this video, I'm going to start experimenting with censoring all my cursing, because I think it's hindering me in the algorithm. The only way really to find out is to, start censoring it all. So, yeah. I mean, I'm going to try and be creative with it, get as many sound effects as I can. But, if that annoys you guys, sorry. I just have to do it. I mean, if it turns out it didn't matter in the first place, I'll probably, change it back. Yeah, but other than that, I'm unsure if I'm still going to do a rant video next week. I'm going to see if any gaming news comes out. If not, I mean, in the meantime, I'm going to start working on the Metroid Prime video, so, Who knows, maybe that'll come out next week instead. But yeah, I guess that's about it. See you next time, guys.